me, BT. Give me a sermon.
Well, to federal politics now and the notion of restoring trust. That's the name and aim of a new bill cracking down on political donations. Introduced by Teal Independent MP Kate Chaney yesterday, the bill would change the rules about who can donate and the volume of money that needs to be declared.
We need to reduce financial influence so we trust governments to make decisions in the best interests of the country. We can't trust our politicians to make decisions about gambling harm if they're secretly beholden to gambling providers. We can't ask them to make decisions about climate if they're financed by fossil fuel companies.
So what would these changes look like? Currently, politicians only have to disclose donations above $15,200 once a year or within 6 months of an election. Under the proposed new laws, that would be lowered to donations of $1,000 or more, and the disclosure would have to occur in real time. Companies and unions would also have to seek backing from their members before donating. Sally, it seems right to start with you here, given that you're a former state director. Before we talk about your response to these potential changes, can you just tell us what the role of a state director is? I mean, you're the one who is there seeing how campaigns are financed.
Yeah, and that is... So I think sometimes people, particularly with major parties, forget that they're membership-based organisations. So members pay a due or a fee, and that is what builds up that money that then pays to fund elections. And we should all be really realistic here that elections cost a lot of money to run for candidates, and Jane would know this from her Senate experience, that they're expensive to run. The money has to come from somewhere, and that is not going to change. So that's what happens. People donate. You can see politicians have lunches where they invite people and people pay a certain fee that lamb or chicken shouldn't cost $600 for a lunch. So that money is going to do things like when you see a political advertisement or when you see a core flute or people wearing T-shirts, that's where that money goes. And I know sometimes it feels really wasteful, but the reality is that's how politics is run. I think, and I can talk about this for a whole episode, but if I just go on and say that we don't want a situation like America where gun lobbies are so powerful and we can see policy in action and we can see that their gun policy is just such a good example of the perils of funding, we equally want to level the playing field so that anyone running for a political seat can fundraise and pay for the same amount of advertising that a bigger competitor can pay for. So it's a really important conversation to have. Funding is really important. Transparency is really important. And still there are loopholes where people can be paid as staff if they're running for a seat and they can run and be paid by a political party, but in reality they're running for a seat and they're campaigning, and that's one particular party that does that all the time. Some people say that's a wonderful scenario to have. I say it needs to be transparent. So politics costs money, and if it's not being paid for by fundraising, it's being paid for by the public, because we want to have an even playing field. You want an independent to be able to have the same airtime and the same advertising that somebody from a big party has. But we shouldn't be disingenuous about where funding comes from.
And that's all part of this, isn't it? I'm sorry to stop you there, Sally, because I wanted to get Jane's thoughts on how you think elections should be funded.
Well, I'm sorry, I think there should be no donations allowed at all. They should be publicly funded. So
because that takes conflict out entirely?
Totally, and I don't think they have to be expensive. They are expensive because people have got an arms race going where the party that has the deepest pockets then can have the biggest spend and so on and so forth. And I think actually if you just said no, each party, maybe it'd be worked out that the two major parties get X amount of money, then there's an X round rung down, so on and so on and so on. And they had to, that's all they could spend. Well, we might get more town halls where we actually got to hear what people were saying. We would still get the core flutes, we'd still get the how to votes, we'd still get the volunteers turning up in the T-shirts. None of those cost very much money. And what we would actually see is perhaps the power of the perspective, the policies, the point of view, the argument, rather than the power of the money, the glitz, the attack ads, all that stuff that actually drives people crazy.
So
I just think get the private donations right out of it, and then the public would know.
Yeah.
You have voted for them. They care about you.
So that's probably unlikely.
Yeah, I
in
know.
this
All the
day
best
and age.
answers are.
Yeah,
That's
but
utopia, I
with
think.
if it is utopia indeed. So Jane, if we put that aside, is what we're looking at here with this private members bill a step in the right direction? It's changing disclosure rules around the donations from $15,000
It's a step in the right direction. But I'm a bit sick of Australia being so timid. We will never do the big thing. We always do the incremental fiddle around the edges until things actually become really dire, and then maybe one hopes we might do the big thing. We're the fourth most prosperous country in the world. We can afford to do some big things. We're just too scared to do them. And so I'm going to keep putting forward the big ideas. I've got anything to lose. No one cares what I say.
You know, we saw with some of the teals with the they didn't have much funding. And
But they were funded. The Teals were funded. This is not an independent race. The Teals were funded.
Some of them were by Simon Holmes of
But there seemed to be a far more engaged proletariat.
Absolutely. Let me tell you, there were a lot of Teals that were not funded. I certainly was not funded. I raised every cent of money that I got myself. And those volunteers out there working for the Teals were absolutely volunteers. They were grassroots community organisations that selected those candidates. They all had to apply to Climate 200 before they were going to get funded. And Simon Holmes of Curtin and his organisation made their decisions according to how they felt they wanted to give their money, in exactly the same way as a big fossil fuel company might decide to give money to Labor and Liberal parties.
So if you're not happy with that as an idea that's clearly not, you know, how do you fix that? I mean, because if we're not going to get to the government funded fully...
Well, we do the fiddling around the edges.
Fiddling around the edges.
I mean,
so
we don't fix it. We slightly improve it.
So let's ask Anthony then, who, you know, is across this from a federal politics perspective. You know, the Albanese government's approach to this issue, you know, what is it? We obviously know a private members bill needs them for the support to pass it, if it were indeed to pass. But what is the Albanese government's appetite towards this sort of reform and getting transparency back into the system?
Oh, I think it's important to acknowledge that the Albanese government has had plans for more than a year to do, you know, some fairly significant things in this space, and a lot of things in Chaney's bill will be a part of a government bill in the coming months. So Chaney is in some respects getting ahead of the government a bit. The government, since the election, well, they basically took it to the election. They are going to implement a real-time disclosure of everything over $1,000. So that's exactly what's in this private members bill. Where I think this bill goes a lot further than what the government will do and will place a fair bit of pressure on the government is talking about banning donations from government contractors. Now, that's clearly targeting, for example, the big four consulting firms after the PwC scandal. And the government will face a bit of pressure to do something on this front. I mean, more than just, you know, we're going to engage a little less consultancies. You know, we're just going to do a bit more of it in-house. You know, that scandal really confirmed our worst fears about how the swamp kind of operates, right? Like, we kind of knew that these big consultancies get these really lucrative contracts for government, at the same time have lucrative contracts with their commercial clients in a very similar policy space, and at the same time give big donations to both sides of politics, and we're supposed to believe that, you know, they manage all of those conflicts appropriately all the time. It kind of confirmed what we knew, but it really struck a chord, I think, and the government, you know, will face some pressure to do more on that front, and that's where that's the aspect of this bill where I kind of look at it and go, it might force Albanese to do something more, because they were going to do a lot of it anyway.
And do you think that might be the final upshot of the introduction of this private members bill? It will just force the government to do more on the big four consulting rather than actually getting them on board to pass it?
Yeah, maybe they have to do something in that space that they weren't otherwise going to do now. I can't see them banning all government contracts, for example. So,
well, and they
bit of a
can't.
wait and see, but I just think they have to do a bit more.
But it begs the question, why do people give donations? to political parties in the first place? Why to gambling concerns? Why to fossil fuel companies? Not just the big four who are going to get contracts, but because they want to influence the kinds of decisions that are made in Parliament.
Yeah, Sally, it's hard to argue against that.
It is, but the core of politics, even for independents, is that, and as Jane has mentioned, volunteers. That's where funding originally came from. That's the grassroots giving to politics. It is hard to influence, and that's how the game is played. And the reality is that there is always going to be swampiness and murkiness. I'm not advocating for that by any means. I believe in authenticity and integrity, and many people do. But unfortunately, there are people also who love to use power and influence. We all know that. But how do we make sure that that is done in the proper framework? I would love to be Pollyanna and Cinderella as well, all at once. And we do have big ideas and good ideas in Australia. And we do get some things done. So I think that we need to know that we work where we can and do the best we can with the tools that we've got until things change. I think everyone on the panel can agree on that.
John, I'd love to get your thoughts on, from the space that you work in, community expectations, ideas around this, and whether or not there's buy-in from the people that you see at the Wayside Chapel about these sorts of issues, about these ideologies, or do they just put it in the list so far down the bottom of the list because they've got more pressing issues at hand?
Well, first of all, let me say, as a clergy member, there's very few professions are rated lower on public opinion and trust than me, and politicians are in that group, so I'm not invested in them taking over. Right, so I need them to stay nice and low. No, but it's...
I didn't realise that.
No, well...
Journos rate all that high.
No, journos as well.
I didn't want to bring that up. I was very quiet on that one.
You know, we restore trust through creating transparency and accountability in what we do, and that's a challenge for us all. And how do we do it openly? There is a sense of helplessness out with the people I have who are deeply impacted by gambling. Deeply impacted by some of the decisions that Clubs New South Wales makes in this state, and the way they can get in the way of some of those really much needed reforms. And so a deep level of cynicism, you know, climate change as well. You know, we're seeing unseasonable wets, unseasonable colds, unseasonable heat. You know, when you take that from the perspective of a street without centralised heating, you know, they're seeing that the fossil fuel lobby are certainly having a louder voice than the green lobby as well. So, you know, there's a sense of do you need to pay to play if you want to be a lobbyist? And it seems like that is the case. And how do we get equal voices for the issues that impact the most vulnerable in our communities?
Because they're seen as having almost no voice at all, and that is the problem. And money talks too much, and that's why, yes, I've come to the radical position of saying, let's get money out of politics.
Yeah, but you know, and also, how do we balance that with living in the real world? And
Well,
not
because the
expecting
real
government
world
to
does
fund
change, and it
campaigns.
doesn't change
Yeah.
if no one's prepared to say it would be better if we did it this way.
Yeah.
Well,
And I
they
think
burn
there
the
has-
heretics at the stake before they become the heroes,
Yeah.
don't they? So,
I just want to end on, Sally, another part of this private members bill is truth in political advertising, you know,
hooray.
essentially fact checking. I mean, how important is this, particularly when you look at the environment that we're in right now in the Year of the Voice?
Well, I think that there's been a lot of discussion around this, and I think everyone's different, and I think we can't tar everyone with the same brush, because I know a lot of politicians, I'm sure everyone on the panel does, who have integrity and who are authentic and who truth tell. And so we can't forget that. I think we're saying that everyone is doing the wrong thing, and unfortunately that is what it sometimes seems like. But I think truth-telling in politics is important. I think in this day and age, and I say this all the time, that authenticity matters, because consumers are so used to reading between the lines now. We are savvier than we've ever been because we've got better access to information, but unfortunately we also fall into that trap of believing when an AI robot works as well. So again, it comes back to critical thinking and being able to read between the lines and being really aware of, and it's the same with the cyber breaches and the cyber security, is that things are going to move very fast in this space, and it's being aware of how to understand information as well. And that goes back to civics, and we can have this conversation for the next hour.
With my advertising hat on, I worked in advertising for 35 years writing ads. We had a Trade Practices Act. We could not lie. We had to be able to prove any claim we make. I do not understand why political advertising should not have to obey by the same rules as commercial advertising. It's got nothing to do with whether some politicians are honest, some politicians are dishonest. If politicians are honest, then they should be all in favour of a Trade Practices Act or similar for the political sphere, because all that will do is stop the fake news. And it's all very well to say people are savvy about reading between the lines. We've never had people believing more absolute crap spouted by politicians, particularly populist politicians, all around the world than we have now. I really think this is a pressing issue, and there's no reason we can't have the same rules for political advertising as we have for commercial advertising.
Let's keep in
And I
mind.
agree, Jane. I'm not disagreeing with that.
How we
John
do
last one to you,
anything is
so-
how we do everything. And let's keep in mind, we're seeing a bill being introduced to increase trust when we know that the two fact sheets coming out for the yes and the no vote aren't fact-checked.
Yes.
Right? So, I mean,
4,000 words pamphlets.
yeah, that's right, which could have been generated by anyone and they don't get to have to be fact-checked at all.
Well, I think there has
So
been
that's a real worry.
fact-checking of them, but by other people than the people who wrote
But then
them.
it becomes that whole debate about that's your truth and that's my truth and that's,
We're
and we
somewhere
get
in the
lost in
middle.
the swamp again.
Hyperbole is
Yeah.
one thing.
Yeah.
A claim is quite easy to distinguish.
All right.
But we'd have to be switched on.
Yep. We've got to be switched on a whole lot of things right now.